Let me welcome Phil Nelson, who will introduce Professor Bialek for our final presentation. And we will have a question period after all this talk. So great. Thanks, Phil.
So, many impressive things could be said about William Bialek, but if I said them all, we'd be here into the night, so I don't want to do that. But many of you are probably aware that Bill wrote a book called Spikes, Exploring the Neural Code. It's full of really important stuff. I learned a lot from this book, and I think about people in terms of how much I learned from that person. I learned a lot from that book, and so could you. Maybe slightly fewer people know that Bill has just recently completed a big book called Biophysics, and you can see it's got lots of sticky notes stuck into it, and my copy there is full of insights that you will not find anywhere else. But I have a feeling that very few people are aware that, you haven't seen this for a long time, have you, Bill? Getting serious, I think Bill nurtured a whole generation of biological physicists by calling into existence something called the Princeton Lectures on Biophysics. And for many of us, it was a chance, it brought in students from all over the planet to hear the greatest stories, the most exciting things right at the time. And surely, Bill, I was not the only tenured professor who went to that thing knowing nothing when I came in and heard all these things that have borne a lot of fruit after that. So thank you, Bill, and I think you're all going to get another installment of that ongoing story right now. So.
It's a great pleasure to be here. It fulfills a lifelong ambition to speak in a philosophy department. That's not meant facetiously. I spent a large fraction of my undergraduate years at Berkeley in philosophy courses, and in what I guess is the kind of revenge that all parents know about. Our children have become philosophers. And we have both kinds. We have an analytic philosopher and a continental philosopher. And so I promised them that I would try not to embarrass them today. Okay, I sort of, as the afternoon was wearing on, I was thinking about points of contact, and I'm not sure I can hold them all. So let me just proceed with what I was planning on saying, and then we'll see how the connections develop. One of the things that's characteristic of the computations that we do is that we sometimes get the wrong answer. And again, one of our kids was telling us about developments in aesthetics, and yet a different part of philosophy. And there was a certain amount of discussion surrounding the fact that if you want to have a theory of art, you have to include bad art. You can't just assert that it's not a work of art. There has to be the possibility of bad art. And so, of course, the theory of computation has to include the possibility of getting the wrong answer. And for human beings, we're all too aware of getting the wrong answer. And this gets a lot of attention. It gets attention in the scientific literature. It's interesting when we get the wrong answer. And it also attracts a certain amount of popular attention, even some that goes very, very far in directions that we perhaps would prefer they didn't, sort of under the "my brain made me do that" category of explanation and excuses. And I actually think that this issue of when we get the wrong answer is kind of important, and it's a little bit facetious to bring it up, but it contains, I think, the seeds of a lot of important issues. And so I want to talk about cases where we get the wrong answer and cases where demonstrably we get the right answer, where right is a statement that we can make with considerable precision, and therein also lies some interest. So let me proceed. So this is one of those ones classic example of one that we are told we get wrong. Test for fatal disease. Unfortunately, the results are positive. You do think to ask about the false positive rate. You're told the false positive rate is only 1%. You may also know that this is a rare disease. Only 1 in 10,000 people get it. You walk out of the doctor's office, and the question is, should you go home and write out your will, or should you not worry? So now, the conventional view of this, so first of all, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because the purpose of this is not to humiliate anyone. It is claimed, and I see no reason to doubt this, that most people will say, of course, there's only 1% chance of it being wrong. I'm doomed. It is then pointed out that, only 1 in 10,000 people get it. So if you test 10,000 people, there should be only 1 who shows up positive. But since the false positive rate is 1%, you'll actually get 100 positives. And so that tells you that the odds are 100 to 1 against you having the disease. Don't worry. Okay. And so this is, right, so the issue here is whether you know how to correctly take account of the prior probability. So can you do the correct Bayesian calculation? And our seeming inability to do that is held up as one of the failures of our ability to reason in general and to reason about probabilities in particular. Now, let me make a couple of remarks. The first remark is that I've tried very hard to find out whether when they tell you the false positive rate of a medical test, they measured the false positive rate on the general population or on the set of people for whom the test is likely to be ordered. I have not found anyone who knows the answer confidently to that just off the top of their head, including my physician. The other point is that although this is advertised as your inability to take account of prior knowledge, prior probabilities in the Bayesian sense, of course the usual Bayesian analysis ignores the most profound example of prior knowledge contained in the formulation of this problem. You went to the doctor and he ordered a test. Evidently there's something wrong with you, okay? And they don't usually test for the fatal diseases first. So by the time you got to the beginning of this problem in real life, you've accumulated, the fact that you got there involves an enormous amount of evidence, okay? And I think our intuition about what's going on when the test is ordered is that somehow we've gotten it down to a few possibilities and we're just distinguishing between that small set of possibilities, and then in that case this number is actually quite irrelevant. So what this shows you is that if you want to make progress, you're going to have to do a better job of defining what the right answer is. Because although this is a fantastic illustration of the difficulties involved in probabilistic reasoning, I think it's really quite imperfect. It's really quite unclear to me whether people are doing it right or wrong in the real world sense of the way these problems come up. Okay? And I think that a lot of the literature what's interesting, of course, is that people do things systematically in these situations, and those regularities are presumably teaching us something about our psychology. But whether one should say that those represent limitations in which we get the wrong answer and thus bounds on our rationality and the whole sequence of things that comes out of that, that seems to be a rather different question. By the way, one of the reasons I find this class of examples interesting is that the glib summary which is given of this kind of phenomenon, human beings are unable to take account of prior probabilities, is a very strange summary to anyone who knows anything about experiments in perceptual psychology, where you routinely try to distinguish between two different signals, and it's well known that people can take account of they shift their criterion for making the distinction depending on the prior probabilities of the signals. And this has been known since people started doing these experiments carefully. So it's not that we're generally unable to take account of prior probabilities. There's something about this set of problems that we do oddly relative to what you might have expected. Okay. So the plan is we're going to try to find examples in which what we mean by the right answer is reasonably precise. The example that I'll start with is a classic. It's the problem of photon counting in vision. I will then talk a little bit about the problem of motion perception, and then I'll wrap back to these more cognitive problems of probability. You'll see, well, maybe, if I do it right, you would see that they are, in fact, to some extent, embedded in the earlier problems. And I guess it's now traditional to note that if you want the technical version of this, it can be found somewhere. Thank you, Phil, you didn't have to advertise, but there is a book. So it's long. And I really have no idea about the audience. So I didn't know, some things may seem obvious, well-known, other things completely puzzling. So I don't know, if it really gets troubling, just interrupt. So I'm going to talk about these issues of getting the right answer, getting the wrong answer, doing things that in some senses can be described as being close to optimal is something that has occupied my colleagues and myself for a very long time. And so although I'm not talking so much, I'm not going to talk about many different things that we've worked on, I did want to acknowledge that by now the perspective that I'm giving you has come out of a large set of collaborations. In particular, it's nice to acknowledge the students and postdocs who have by now grown up and are having their own students and postdocs. All right, but crucially, don't hold them responsible for anything weird that I say. Good, so classic example. You sit in a dark room, you sit there for a long time, so your visual system is fully dark adapted, and there's a dim flash of light, and I ask you whether you saw it. Now it's obvious that if the flash is bright enough, you'll see it every time, and the flash is sufficiently dim, you'll never see it. The interesting thing is what happens in between. So there's a regime for some intensity of the flash where your perception fluctuates from trial to trial. The experimenter does the same thing every time, and sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. And you say, okay, you're not paying attention. Okay, you work on all of that, and there's still a regime in which your behavior is probabilistic. And as far as anybody can tell, we can't get rid of that. So the question is, what is the origin of that probabilistic behavior? And the answer, and I'm glossing over a lot of things here. The answer is that the answer is quantum mechanics. Okay. Light is quantized, comes in photons. Photons are discrete. Even if I could somehow arrive at your retina a fixed number of photons, which is awfully hard to do, their absorption would be random. Their absorption by the pigment molecules that eventually trigger your vision would be random. And so even if the experimenter does the same thing over and over again, the number of photons which will actually be absorbed will be a random number. And in fact, it'll be drawn from, unless you do something weird to the light that's coming in, it will be drawn from the Poisson distribution. And so we know exactly what the probability should be. And if you imagine that what people are doing is counting these discrete quantal events up to some threshold, and then when they reach that threshold, they're willing to say, yes, I saw it, then we have a complete prediction of what this probability of seeing as a function of the brightness of the flash should look like. And what you can see is that it looks like people have to count to 6. Now, the way these experiments are done, the light flash covers a region of your retina in which there are hundreds of individual photoreceptor cells. So if there are 6 photons that fall on, for convenience, 600 cells, then on average, right, 1 in 100 cells actually receives 1 photon. Essentially no cells see 2 photons. And so the only way this could work is if the individual cells respond to single photons, and you can count them up. So instead of asking you, did you see it or not, I ask you, how bright was the flash? Give me a number, let's say, from 0 to 6. What's amazing is that if you ask people to do that, the number that they give you is proportional to the intensity of the flash. The variance, if you consider all the flashes of the same intensity, you find that the variance of the number that they give you is essentially equal to the mean, which is a characteristic of the Poisson distribution. And in fact, if you dig out the data more completely, you can see that the probability distribution is not so far from being Poisson. That's a harder experiment, right? Because you have to measure the probability of many different events, and people are only willing to sit there in the dark for so long. Actually, if you look carefully, you'll notice that even when the intensity of the flash is 0, people don't always say 0. And this is related to the fact that normally you have to count up to 6 before you're willing to declare that you saw something. So these experiments have their origins in the 1940s. People were worried about this issue of why you count up to 6. In the 1950s, Barlow pointed out that any photodetector, including the ones in the physics labs, has dark noise. In particular, for instance, if you have a photomultiplier tube, one photon arrives and you get a pulse of current out, you'll find, first of all, that the current is always rumbling in the background, and that every once in a while you get a pulse of current out that looks just like a photon arrival. In fact, as we'll see in a moment, that's also true of the receptor cells in your eye, and the reason is that the whole process is triggered by one pigment molecule, the rhodopsin molecule, absorbing a photon, and the molecule then changes its structure and triggers a cascade of biochemical reactions which eventually lead to the electrical signal that finds its way to your brain. But there's some probability that those molecules will undergo that structural change spontaneously as a result of a thermal fluctuation without the photon. And so if that's happening at some background level, then you have to count enough events to be sure that what you saw was not a coincidence from those fluctuations. But of course, if I ask you how bright was the flash, and you're really counting, then you'll just count them and report the counting. And in fact, the number that you get in this experiment is very close to the number that Barlow estimated as an explanation for why you have to count up to 6. By the way, as an aside, those experiments in which you're only willing to say yes when you count to 6, there was another group that did the same experiment, and they got 2. And of course, this caused problems for a long time. Turns out that one group instructed the subjects that if they ever said yes when there was a blank, they had to go home for the afternoon and start over the next day. The other group said, well, every once in a while I throw in a blank, try not to say yes in the blanks, but don't worry about it. So one group involved Belgians and the other one was Dutch, and you can decide which was which. And so it was that difference that Barlow used to try to estimate how much of this dark noise there had to be. Okay. So, as I said, every cell has to be responding to a single photon, so let's take the opportunity to learn a little bit about what actually happens. This is a rod cell. One of these photoreceptor cells has been taken out of the retina. In one of the standard experimental organisms for this is a larval salamander. It doesn't really matter. This works pretty much the same way in all vertebrate animals. Everything that I'm saying has a mapping to the case of invertebrates, which will come up in a moment. But it doesn't matter really whether it's a salamander or a monkey for these purposes, or us, as far as we know. All of the rhodopsin molecules are packed into that outer segment. There's some biochemistry which occurs which causes current to flow across that membrane, which then produces a voltage change, which eventually finds its way down to the end of the cell, where those voltage changes get translated back into a chemical signal, a change in calcium concentration, and that triggers the release of vesicles, which cross the synapse to the next cell in line. And if you went down to the basement, you would eventually get to the cells of the optic nerve, which carry all this information from the retina to the brain, from the eye to the brain. Okay? Now, in order to understand, so the experiments I showed you before, starting in the 1940s, actually starting even earlier than that, but they kind of reached a conclusion in the 1940s, were experiments on human observers, right? These are macroscopic experiments in every sense of the word. It took a very long time before you could do the experiment of seeing what the individual receptor cells were actually doing. So by the late 1970s, this was possible. And the way you do it is to suck up the receptor cell into a pipette. And now any of the current that flows across the cell membrane flows up into the pipette. And you put an amplifier at the other end of the pipette, and you can measure the current. And when you do that, you get results like the one shown up on the right there. And what you see is that when you flash the light, the sequence of flashes is shown at the bottom, you get a sequence of responses. Sometimes you get no response. Sometimes you get a response that seems to be about 1 unit in amplitude. Sometimes you get a response that's 2 units in amplitude. And you discover, if you count enough times, that the probability of 0, 1, and 2 are what they should be for the Poisson distribution. And if you change the intensity of the flash, you shift the mean, but you also shift the entire distribution. What you're seeing when you see the responses of amplitude 1 is the response to a single photon. And if you really want to check, what you should do is to measure with a very dim light the probability of generating one of those things, one of those responses. You show that it's proportional to the intensity of the light that you flash. And then, in a setup like this, you actually measure the absorption of the light by the rod cell. And you show that the proportionality constant that relates the probability of generating an event to the light intensity is the probability of absorbing a photon times 2/3. So when the photon is absorbed, you have a 2/3 probability that you generate one of these events, okay? Which is pretty good, actually. You'll notice that, as I promised, there's some rumbling in the background. And if you look very carefully, when I was looking for an assistant professorship, I ended up in Berkeley, which was my alma mater, so that was very nice. And I had to give a physics colloquium. And it's an enormous hall. And of course, my experience of this had always been as a student, watching all these famous people come and talk, and so it was very intimidating. But an advantage was that their scheme for a pointer was this enormous steel stick. And you know, the senior faculty who had tormented me as a student were in front. Yeah. So if you look here, you'll notice that there's a flash and a response, a flash and a response, a flash and a response, a flash and a response. But sometimes a flash and no response, but then there's this weird one where there's a response and then a flash. You'll notice that this gap is way too large to be the response to this flash, and it comes before this one. So that should worry you, except you remember Barlow's discussion that there are spontaneous events. This is one of them, and if you do this experiment long enough, you can count how often they occur, and they come out at the rate that Barlow predicted. Okay. It's a lot of, there's a lot that you have to do to make the comparison, right? You should be sure to do it in rod cells from monkeys whose visual systems are as much like us as can be. You have to remember that you were talking about doing the experiment on a person sitting there, and you know, some of the light gets lost between the cornea and the retina. A lot of stuff you have to worry about, but it works. Good. So this is an example. If this is all right, then what it tells you is that under these conditions, when you're sitting there in a dark room, your ability to perceive a dim flash of light is not perfect, but it's limited by counting individual photons, and the reliability with which you can count the photons arriving from the outside is limited by these spontaneous events which are occurring in the photoreceptors, and to first approximation, everything that happens after that adds no noise at all. And so in that sense, you're doing as well as you possibly can. Okay? So these cases where you're asking about the reliability with which you can say yes or no, essentially discriminating a signal from a noisy background, in those cases, what we mean by the right answer, what we mean by doing well, is very precise. Okay? And in examples like this, we reach the limit. Now, it turns out that in order to do this, you have to get lots of things right. So, again, you might worry about this problem of dark noise. And the problem with dark noise, you know, it's serious. That is actually what limits your ability to see on a dark night. And if you turn the rate of those spontaneous events into a rate not per cell, but per molecule of rhodopsin. Remember, you have to pack lots of rhodopsin in there to make sure that you absorb as much of the light as you can. But every molecule does its thing independently. So if the rate of these spontaneous events is perhaps once per minute per receptor cell, then that comes out to roughly once per 1,000 years for individual molecules. So when the photon arrives, the structural change happens in less than 1,000th of 1 billionth of a second. When the photon doesn't arrive, the structural change takes 1,000 years. If you take the core of the rhodopsin molecule and take it out of its biological context, so there's the actual organic pigment that absorbs the light, and then there's this big protein that surrounds it. If you take the retinal out, then once per 1,000 years becomes once per year, so the thing would be going, you'd have 1,000 times more noise. And the once per 1,000th of a billionth of a second becomes only once per billionth of a second, which you might think is plenty, but molecules will re-emit light within a billionth of a second. And so in fact, a significant fraction of the light wouldn't trigger any structural change at all. So nature has engineered a catalyst which is electronic state dependent, so that when you're in the ground state, you slow the reaction down by 3 orders of magnitude. And when you're in the excited state that you reach by absorbing a photon, you speed it up by 3 orders of magnitude. And that's why you're able to see when it's dark outside. Okay? So there's a lot of, if you want, molecular scale selection that has gone into doing that. There's other problems. I have a cell with 1 billion pigment molecules in it. One of them changes its structure, and that produces a reliable change in the current. How do I connect all billion molecules to the current, but have only one of them be enough to change things? That's an interesting question, and raises the question of whether this business of counting the effect of a single molecule is a more general phenomenon in biology, and it is, and it thus shouldn't have quotation marks. It certainly shouldn't have shouldn't have the quotation marks, because it really is a general phenomenon. I told you that when you do these experiments, you're sitting there and there's a region with several hundred photoreceptors, and half a dozen of them actually saw one photon. And those signals in the individual receptor cells aren't that big. So how do you make sure that those signals don't get lost, that you can actually pool them together? And in fact, there's a bigger problem, which is that if, remember that's that rumbling in the background. If you're naive and just add everything up, then the hundreds of cells that don't see anything, their little bit of rumbling will add up to swamp the real signal. So there has to be something about the circuitry that takes care of all of this. And it makes you wonder whether, if you think hard about how it is that you manage to make these very reliable distinctions, you might actually start to have something like a theory of the way these circuits are supposed to compute. Finally, if you knew nothing about what to expect when you're sitting there, you couldn't possibly do this. For example, if you didn't know when the flash was going to occur, then instead of looking in a very small window of time, you'd have to integrate over a very large window of time. And in that larger window, of course, you'll get more noise. So there's something about your knowledge of what to expect that allows you to solve this problem as efficiently as you do. And that's what's related back to this problem of learning probabilities. So let me talk about a different problem, which is harder. It's one step up. And that's the problem of motion estimation. And you might ask yourself why it's hard to estimate motion, because we do it effortlessly. I mean, if I tell you that it's hard to be sure that you saw the flash when it's really dark outside, you have to think back to, you know, taking a walk on a very dark night, and you kind of have the feeling it's hard to see, and you're not so surprised. If I ask you about motion, you know, if I throw an object out there, you know, everyone will reach up and catch it, and, you know, you might catch it or you might not, right? The selection criteria for audiences like this is not on that skill. But nonetheless, no one would think that the reason they didn't catch it is because they didn't see it moving, right? It seems easy, but it's not. This thing that we do effortlessly, and indeed much of our effortless perception of the world, is in fact quite difficult, as you will see in a moment. So imagine, and this is about as mathematical as it'll get, so a little bit of calculus, I apologize. Suppose that what you see essentially is a fixed world, so there's some pattern I of x, actually it should be I0 of x, I'm sorry, and you move through the world along some trajectory x0. So what you think of is you all sit still and I just rotate my head, right? Okay, so then what's going to happen is that the whole world is going to translate on my retina. And if you imagine taking one slice through that world that looks like this, and you follow it over time, then as you move your head around, you know, you'll see some pattern that kind of flows, right? Here you're moving in one direction, here you're moving in the other direction. Fine. So how do I estimate your velocity? How do I look at this and compute that here you're going this way at this speed, here you're going this way at that speed? Well, from this it looks easy. The statement that what you're seeing is motion is the statement that the way things change in time and the way they change in space are related to each other, right? If something's moving, then you know it was here and now it's here. If I want to know what it's going to look like a little moment in the future, what I should do is take this whole pattern in space. Of course, if the pattern is flat and doesn't change at all, then when things move, nothing changes. At the places where there are boundaries or where there are significant changes in light intensity, then at those points, I'm going to see something change in time when the object moves or when I move relative to it. So if I take a derivative with respect to position and a derivative with respect to time, these are related to one another. And in fact, if you take the ratio, you get back the derivative of your position, which is just velocity. So computing motion is not hard at all. Well, probably is, right? Or I wouldn't be telling you this. So there must be something wrong here. And what's wrong is that this operation, I mean, there's many problems here, but I want you to focus on something that here what you've done is you take derivatives and you take ratios. And it turns out that any good experimentalist will tell you that if you have data that's a little bit noisy, there are two things you should never do. You should never take derivatives and you should never divide. And here you have to do both, one of them twice. The reason you should never take derivatives is from this intuition that signals are smooth and noise is rough. And that's true in space, and it's true in time. So if I ask you how things change in space, you know, the textures of objects they're smooth. I mean, there are boundaries, of course, but mostly it's quite smooth. On the other hand, if what you're seeing are the random arrivals of individual photons, which are discrete, right? The fluctuations in those arrivals are very bumpy, right? At this moment, a few extra photons arrive here. Right next to it, the cell sees a few fewer photons, and so on. So if you think about a smooth signal and a very rough pattern of noise, and you add them together, well, here the typical amplitude of the signal is 10 times the amplitude of the noise. So you add them together, and if you look at this, it's not hard to sort of see that in the background, right? Maybe, you know, there is a field called signal processing, which is about how you go back from this to that. You have to do some work, but if you look at the comparison, it doesn't seem so hard, right? On the other hand, if you differentiate these signals, when you differentiate this signal, you get this. But when you differentiate this signal, you get that. And I challenge you to find the signature of this in that mess. Okay? This is why you shouldn't differentiate noisy signals. And of course, you also shouldn't divide. Because if I take a real number and I want to divide by it, but it got a random number added to it, there's always the chance that together they make 0, and I divide by 0, I get nonsense. So this very simple calculation that you could do in order to estimate motion would be right if you had access to this pristine signal. But in the real world, where signals are noisy, it's not going to work. So what do animals actually do? So this is a question that my colleagues and I thought about a long time ago, and the example that we picked was not human vision, but fly vision. My colleague Rob de Ruiter did these beautiful experiments where you reach in to a particular corner of the fly's brain where you find individual neurons that are sensitive to motion. So if you set the fly down, there's actually a fly here, sitting right here. It's nice, you could do experiments on animals, but somebody walked into the room and it just looks like a physics lab, because this is attached to some rack of equipment and there's display things, and nobody could tell that there was actually a fly there. So if you listen into these neurons, so the simple experiment is you put the fly down, you have the electrode sitting next to one of these neurons, and you take your hand and you move it in front of the fly this way, and you attach the output of the electrode through an amplifier to a loudspeaker. You move your hand this way and you hear brrr. As the neuron responds, you move your hand that way and the neuron goes completely silent. And what's happening, of course, is that you're hearing the action potentials that these neurons generate. All of the neurons in your brain communicate to one another using action potentials. They're about a millisecond wide. They occur at rates that go from, well, they can be 0 essentially. You can get bursts that are much faster. A typical average, long-term average might be 10 or 20 of these things per second. And so this means that in the fly takes its input from the retina, it goes through several processing stages, and then it comes to this part of its brain and it writes down in this sequence of action potentials something about motion. And we know it's about motion because of the experiment where you move your hand, but you can also do an experiment where you take the fly, you hang him from a torsion balance, and you rotate the world in front of him, and he tries to fly and stabilize the equivalent of straight flight. Okay? And if you prevent him from actually turning, but measure the torque that he's producing and feed it back to the visual stimulus, you've created a kind of virtual reality for the fly. This is a very old experiment, actually. And if you kill one of these neurons, you discover that there are very specific deficits in the fly's ability to do that stabilization. And so, he'll be able to stabilize if there's a stripe over on this side of his retina, but not on this side. He'll be able to stabilize against things moving this way, but not that way, and so on. So you can see that these neurons are obligatory links in the behavioral response to visual motion. And we can listen in on them. And if you listen in on them, you can record the action potentials, and you can do this while the fly is watching a movie in which things are moving. And by looking at the action potentials, you can actually decode the trajectory of the motion. And you can ask how accurate is your reconstruction, and you can compare that with the limit that's set by the noise that's actually in the photoreceptors, which you can also go measure. So you have this, you imagine that what the fly is seeing is not the real movie that you showed it, but the noisy version that actually shows up in the receptors, which you can calibrate. And you can see that because the fly has to make estimates very rapidly, it's flying after all, you can't wait for a second if you're flying at a meter per second, right? And you're only this big. Right? In fact, it takes only 30 milliseconds for the fly to respond. So in 30 milliseconds, the individual photoreceptors have a sort of intrinsic frame rate of about 10 milliseconds. So essentially, they get 2 snapshots of the world, and from that, they can compute motion. But those snapshots are noisy, and we know how noisy they are. So you can calculate from that noise level, what's the limit to the accuracy with which you can compute the displacement from one frame to the next, which is the velocity. And what you find is that the precision of these reconstructions is essentially within a factor of 2 of that limit. So what that tells you is that the fly, and of course in order to get this right, you have to remember that their view is not only noisy, it's also blurry, because they're looking out through those little lenses in the compound eye. So, we know that this is a hard problem because of noise. We know that the fly solves it with a precision that's close to the limit that's set by the noise level in the retina, not in the brain. So what does he need to do in order to do this calculation? Well, many years ago, wonderful student Mark Ponners and I tried to do this problem. And of course, in order to actually solve this problem, you have to start making some assumptions that go back to that discussion that I gave at the beginning about what do you need to do in order to be good at counting photons? Well, you have to know something about what to expect. So if you live in a world which is completely chaotic and unpredictable, then you can't do anything to beat down the noise, right? Every little pixel at every moment is independent of everything else. That you can't get anywhere. So you have to assume that the world is somewhat smooth, that the trajectories of motion themselves are somewhat smooth, and then you can make a theory of estimation. And that theory of estimation predicts lots of features to the motion computation which are actually seen in the computations done by the fly, and by the way, by us. But the problem is that you have to make all these assumptions, and we don't know whether those assumptions are right. And there's an analog of this in many different areas of neuroscience where people have talked about the possibility that our perceptual computations are essentially the optimal estimates combining noisy data with prior information in the correct Bayesian way, which gets us back to the thing we started with. The problem is that those theories depend on knowing the actual prior distribution and on knowing just how noisy the data are. And if you say, well, I kind of know what they are, but there are some parameters, to be fair, you could almost explain anything. So what you need to do is find a situation in which you can really tell what the distributions are like and how noisy things are. Now, this is a case, in the fly, we know how noisy things are because we can calibrate the noise level of the receptors. But what are the distributions like? So my colleague, Rob Duvaucher, the same one who I've been working with all these years, has done a fantastic thing, which is he went and built a special purpose camera that mimics the optics of the fly's eye, except that it has a collecting area which is 1,000 times larger. So that means that he gets an image of the world, which is the image the fly would see, except he counts 1,000 times more photons. So he has, as it were, the noiseless, something close to the noiseless version, to which you could then corrupt in ways that match the real noise level of the photoreceptors. And then you mount this thing, this camera thing, and you take a walk through the woods. And now you can put a gyroscope on this, and so you know how it's moving, and you have the movies that are falling on the retina. So now you can ask, now I have access to all the data, right? If I want to know about probability distributions, I can just get them from the samples. So I can ask, for instance, if I take a very local view, and I just look in a small neighborhood, I know that I should build my estimate of motion out of spatial and temporal changes. But how should I compose them? Well, what I can do is I can measure the local spatial gradient, the derivative of the intensity with respect to position, and the local temporal gradient, the derivative with respect to time. And over the course of a long walk in the woods, every time I find myself at this point, I can ask, what was the rotational velocity of the detector? And the average of those will be my best estimate. And then I can make a map. And so this is a map of the optimal computation. It shares a lot with the things that we did 20 years ago, except no assumptions. This is the real data. And what you see is that, so this is a spatial derivative, this is a temporal derivative, and remember where we started was we said, well, what's divide? Take the ratio. So then in that case, that would mean that if you think about all the situations in which velocity is constant, those should correspond to straight lines, right? Constant ratio. And what you see is that out here, if you follow a straight line, you stay on the same color, which corresponds to the same velocity. In fact, it's even the same on the other side, which is kind of encouraging. But in here, that's not true at all. In here, you have some completely different structure. Instead of seeing things that look like the constant velocity lines are lines, they seem to be these funny shaped curves, which if you go back to your high school geometry, you realize that these contours are contours in which the product of these two variables is constant rather than their ratio. Okay? I should also tell you that this region where you see this structure that seems kind of funny, not what you expected from the ratios, this region contains 90% of your walk through the woods. To get out here where you see the simple linear relation that you might have naively guessed, that only happens about 10% of the time. Most of your life you spend in this region where the structure of the calculation is quite odd. In fact, what it is that you're making an estimate of velocity that's much closer to being the product of these gradients than their ratio. And this is actually an idea that goes back at least to the 1950s, that insects, and actually us, compute motion by computing a correlation across space and time, okay? Which is a correlation to the product. It has a product structure, not a ratio structure. So what's interesting is that when we did the theory long ago, we realized that if things are very noisy, then this is actually the best you can do. But what we didn't know is how noisy is very noisy. And what I just showed you is that on a typical day, if you have optics like the fly, and actually you can make the argument this is true for us too, then most of the data that you collect is in this regime where you're dominated by noise. It's much more important to insulate yourself against the effects of noise than it is to insulate yourself against the fact that this is the wrong answer, right? This is the right answer for the ideal data. This is demonstrably the wrong answer because if I double the light intensity, I take the velocity and multiply by 4, which is crazy, right? Except that there's a regime in which flies and us actually do that. In fact, this is such a bad idea that I can create a random movie in which there are no moving objects, but this product on average across the image is not 0. And if I do that, you should see something move. And if I change how I do it, I can slow it down, and I can make it stop, and I can even make it go the other way. There are no moving objects in this image. There's nothing moving. What this is two randomly flickering, basically white noise patterns, which have been displaced and added together with a displacement in space and a displacement of one frame in time. And that causes this quantity to have a non-zero average, and as a result, you see motion. And flies do too, and by pushing these kinds of things, you can try to dissect the computation the fly is doing, and perhaps provide evidence that it's really doing the computation we think it needs to do in order to be nearly optimal. Okay, let me come back to these ideas about probability. So again, you understand that embedded in what I just told you is the idea of taking advantage of the distribution of the signals in the real world. Okay? So you're somehow taking account of probabilities. You're using those probabilities in an essential way. But what if we go back to these things where you really have to make judgments about probability? So a classic example is if I show you a sequence of coin flips, you have to decide whether this is a fair coin or not. And there are various cues. If you see runs, you might think, suspicious. But on the other hand, if you see alternations, you might think that that's a pattern. So this is a classic problem, right? So what's actually going on in this particular thing is that this set of data was not a fair coin. It was a coin that remembers its last flip and biases its probability. And it's biased to have positive correlation, so there are more runs. But you'll notice that you can actually get alternation, even in this case. This one is a truly fair coin. Or at least as close as I can get on my computer. I didn't go out and measure photon polarization. And long runs happen at random. So what this tells you, of course, and I think you all know this, is that if I give you a truly random coin and one that has some statistical structure, in this case a very simple serial correlation, there's some probability you'll get confused. Okay? So if I ask you to do this task, the fact of the matter is that you cannot do it perfectly, but you can do it well. And indeed, if you do it as well as you can, then depending on how many runs there are in the sequence, so some sequences are easier than others, right? If you see this, this almost never happens in the, what, 2 to the minus 10 or something, right? In the case of the fair coin, but with the correlated one, it can happen. And so if you see this and you say it's correlated, you'll be right almost every time. If you see lots of alternation, then it's probably the random one and not the positively correlated one. In between, things get harder. The best you can do, theoretically, is this, and that's what people do. Okay? By the way, you do realize that this means that in order to achieve this, you have to look at an alternating sequence and say, yeah, that was a fair coin. Because the alternative was one with positive correlation. That's not so easy to do, right? Just at a gut level. If I see head, tail, head, tail, head, tail, head, tail, to say, yeah, no, nothing going on, it's all random, that's hard to do. Actually, if I do it the other way, it's even harder. If I ask you to discriminate between random and negative correlation, then if you see 10 heads in a row, you're supposed to smile and say, yeah, that was random. It is very hard for people to learn to do that, and they sort of creep toward that over the course of the experiment. And in fairness, you kind of run out of steam before you get people there. But they're going in the right direction. If you do more reasonable things, then they perform close to the optimum. Hidden in this work, there are some remarkable observations about what happens if you change the instructions to the observers. If you try to explain to them too much about what you're looking for, some fraction of them just get completely confused and never learn the task. The best thing to do is to just tell them whether they got it right or not, and let them figure out what they're looking for. Which, by the way, suggests that what is true about our cognitive limitations is that our language for talking about probability isn't very good. Our judgments, on the other hand, can be just fine. There's a remarkable body of work by Josh Tannenbaum and his colleagues that takes this yet further. If you meet somebody who's, 60 years old, and you ask, how old are they going to get? Well, if you meet somebody young, then the answer is they're going to get to the average lifespan of a human, right? If you meet somebody very old, the answer is, well, they'll live a little longer. And how you go from one to the other depends on that is to say, your best estimate of how much longer they'll live depends on the distribution of lifespans. Remarkably, if you do this with people, and you ask them to do the guessing, their guesses, at least averaged over lots of people, follow the trajectory that you expect by doing the optimal computation. Again, suggesting that we do actually know something about probability distributions. Okay, what have we learned? In problems where you're trying to make a decision with noisy data, what it means to get the right answer is very clear. You can't be perfect because the data are noisy, but there is a best you can do. Similarly, if you're trying to estimate something, decisions are easier, but estimation is not so bad. And there are many examples, of which I've shown you a couple, in which we and other animals are capable of getting very close to that limit, where there's some fundamental source of noise that you can't get rid of, and your reliability gets close to the limit that's set by that noise source. That suggests that although we can engineer situations in which you seem to get the wrong answer, there are many situations, some vital to our survival, in which we get the right answer, and it's right in a very deep sense that the source of noise is something that we essentially can't get rid of for physical reasons. So evolution has somehow pushed the performance of these systems to the edge of what physics allows. Why does that matter? Well, Calvin and Hobbes will reappear. I was charmed that Arthur was Calvin. So there's this cartoon. There's a lot going on in this cartoon. As I think many of you appreciate, this is really about gender roles in parenting. But it's also about your view of the world. You see, in the view propounded by the nameless father, you may recall that in Calvin, I guess, do people still read Calvin and Hobbes? If you had an 8-year-old boy at the right time, it was vital. The point of view espoused by the father, right? How do you figure out the load limit on the bridge? Well, you drive bigger and bigger trucks over it until the bridge falls down, weigh the last truck, rebuild the bridge. Hopefully the number that you post is a little less than the weight of the last truck. This is the view of engineering as tinkering, right? In this view, there is no possibility that you could have calculated at the beginning what the load limit is by knowing something about the structural properties of steel, right? The only way you could do it is to try it. Now, you may or may not be surprised to learn that many people think this is how evolution works, okay? Evolution as tinkerer. That what we see is, the things that happen to work. And it is, I think, fundamentally a kind of anti-theoretical view. Right? If it were really true, for instance, that when we did computations like the ones that we started with about the fatal disease, and we made some weird pattern of errors that was not because we sort of formulated the problem in a weird way, but just some arbitrary thing, then what you're saying is that the computations that we're doing, there's just some set of things we do in this situation, and there's another set of things we do in this situation, and another set of things we do in this situation, and they're not something that makes sense in a larger theoretical framework. Right? Of course, if you get the right answer, it makes sense in a larger theoretical framework. There's some class of computations you can do. Okay? But if you're just getting wrong answers willy-nilly, then it's not like that. It's what we happen to arrive at by this trial and error, and for some reason this class of errors has never been punished, and so we continue to make them. So, if you really believe that the most important part of evolution is the random part, remember that evolution consists of the random generation of variation and then selection. And so if you think that it's the random generation of variation that dominates and then historical accidents occur that freeze in some of that randomness, then the only thing you can say about life as we see it today is that it's related to what life was like in the past, because the trajectory was random. If, on the other hand, it's selection that dominates, and organisms have been pushed to the edge of what they can do, then you can have a theory, because, this might not be the right theory, but at least it creates the possibility of a theory, because it tells you that it's not the case that everything goes and all you can say is that time t is related to time t minus 1. There are properties of the system at time t that actually matter because they were strongly selected for. Okay? The prejudice that we should have a mathematical theory for the state of the world as we see it today is not exactly news. There's several reasons I bring this up. One is, of course, I'm a theoretical physicist, and this is the beginning of theoretical physics. It is, of course, much more elegant in Italian than in its usual summary in English. In particular, it's not only the case that you have to write. It sits in this grand book that lies open in front of your eyes. You have to understand, right? It's written in this mathematical language, but it's important to realize that if you don't learn that, you're sentenced to the labyrinth. The great evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr remarked that the only reason Galileo said that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics is because he didn't know biology. Okay? So there really is a lot at stake here. It's just because many of us come from a mathematical tradition and we presume that the goal is to describe nature in mathematical terms, it isn't obvious that we will succeed in doing that for things that are as complex as the brain. And there are people, perfectly sensible, or I should say otherwise sensible, people who have made distinguished contributions who are absolutely certain that it's not possible and that in fact it's completely misguided. So I think this question of being sure we understand where the wrong answers come from is critical to the whole program of having a mathematical description of what the brain is doing. Okay? If the pattern of errors is just a historical accident, then we really can't have a mathematical theory. And obviously, I'm an optimist, and so that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
So on behalf of the School of Arts and Sciences and Penn Engineering, I am very pleased to welcome you to today's symposium on computation from axiomatization to embodiment, which is sponsored by the Thomas and Yvonne Williams Fund for the Advancement of Logic and Philosophy. We are most grateful for the generosity and vision that Tom and Yvonne have shown in establishing the fund that supports this series of symposia and that makes possible other educational activities at the university and at upper schools in our region. It was a great pleasure to work with Tom when I first arrived at Penn and to watch him develop, through his study of logic and philosophy, that clarity of mind which he has so successfully brought to bear in the sphere of practical affairs, and that sustains his ongoing passion for the life of the mind. And it remains a great pleasure to work with him now on a range of activities that will advance a general appreciation of the power of reason to clarify problems, both practical and theoretical. Computation is surely one of the central notions that have fueled philosophical, scientific, and technological progress for nearly a century. From the seminal conceptual and mathematical investigations of Gödel and Turing, which lined both the scope and limits of algorithmic computability, through the work of von Neumann and Feynman, which suggested new directions in scientific exploration of embodied computation, to the dizzying array of algorithmically based technological innovations which pervade contemporary life. We are excited to have with us today three eminent philosophers and scientists, Wilfried Sieg, Umesh Vazirani, and William Bialek, to share with us perspectives on the Church-Turing thesis, on some foundational issues in quantum computation, and on the flow of information in biological systems. And I am delighted that each will be introduced by a distinguished colleague here at Penn. William Ewald, Professor of Law and Philosophy, Sampath Kannan, Henry Salvatore, Professor and Chair in the Department of Computer and Information Science, and Philip Nelson, Professor of Physics, will introduce Professor Sieg, Vazirani, and Bialek, respectively. There will be a brief break for coffee from 3:30 to 3:45, and a discussion period following Professor Bialek's lecture at 4:30. Thanks, and please welcome Professor Ewald.
Well, it's an honor as well as a pleasure to be introducing Wilfried Sieg. Wilfried did his undergraduate studies in Germany, studying mathematics and physics, before going to Stanford to do his doctoral work in mathematical logic. After doing that, he taught at Columbia for the better part of a decade before moving to Carnegie Mellon, which is where he now is. His work combines in a rather unique way technical work in proof theory, work on the theory and the history of computation, as well as work more generally in philosophy of mathematics. Since he's going to be talking about computation today, let me say something about another aspect of his work that's perhaps a little bit oblique to today's topic, but extremely important. That's his work as a textual editor of logicians of the 20th century, which has been, I must say, quite selfless. Wilfried has worked on the publication of the collected works of Kurt Gödel, on the Hilbert edition. Each of those, Gödel and Hilbert, the editions run to about a half dozen volumes each. So you've already got a substantial logic library. Also the philosophical papers of Paul Bernays. This is work that requires a great deal of technical competence, a great deal of care with the texts, and Wilfried's work in that area has been absolutely exemplary and indeed, within a small circle of people, famous. But it's not just, well, that work is not just sort of a matter of reconstructing text, but it's something that deeply informs Wilfried's own research, which, as much as anybody working today, manages to combine deep historical reflection with technical work in mathematical logic and philosophical perception and drawing of philosophical conclusions, reaching back to 19th century mathematics, to the work of Dedekind, Gauss, Riemann, Dirichlet, and others. As I say, there's nobody else working today who has done more to combine these various fields. This is something that's evident on every page of the book that he's just published, called Hilbert's Programs and Beyond, which I commend to all of you. As I say, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome Wilfried Sieg, and he will be talking about the theory of computation.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I don't know how I can live up to Bill's glowing remarks. Thank you. I want to thank also Scott Weinstein and Bill, of course, for inviting me to be here. It is an honor to participate in the Williams Symposium, and I also want to thank Tom and Yvonne Williams for their generous support to advance logic, philosophy, and technology. As you all may know, Patrick Supis passed away 2 weeks ago. He has contributed enormously to the goals of the symposium. Personally, he has been a teacher, close colleague, and dear friend for many years, ever since my graduate student days, and they are quite a few years behind me. I have to say, what I have to say today has been deeply influenced by his thinking and by his work. So, computations. I think they are pervasive in contemporary science and life. They are visible everywhere. The concept of computation emerged, however, in an almost invisible corner of our intellectual life. It was needed to solve particular and at the time quite esoteric problems at the intersection of mathematics, logic, and philosophy. My analysis of the emergence of this concept provides a novel perspective for characterizing computations axiomatically. Thus, in a certain way, it suggests radically changing these central methodological issues surrounding computations through an approach that is ultimately rooted in the transformation of mathematics in the second half of the 19th century. My talk will be rather informal. I avoid any technicality whatsoever, I hope. So in order to give you the opportunity, if matters that I'm going to be discussing, to check them out in detail, mathematical, historical, or philosophical. There are a few things I would like to point to. There are a number of references. There's a beautiful collection of papers on computability during Gödel Church and beyond that was edited by Copeland, Posey and Chagrier, and a couple of my papers, in which, in particular in this big one, you find lots of references to the literature, contemporary and classical. The transformation of mathematics in the 19th century I just mentioned found its most distinctive expression in the axiomatic method that is closely associated with Hilbert. Hilbert was among the great mathematicians who expounded the centrality of mathematics in human thought. Late in 1930, he gave a lecture addressing the vexed question about the share which thought on the one hand and experience on the other have in our knowledge. To illuminate his view, Hilbert asserted that mathematics is the instrument that mediates between theory and practice, between thought and observation. He claimed that it builds the connecting bridges and makes them ever sounder. In the very next sentence, he drew a dramatic consequence of his view of mathematics and its use in the sciences. He said, "Our entire modern culture, insofar as it rests on the penetration and utilization of nature, has its foundations in mathematics." Today, Hilbert's claims for mathematics hold especially for those parts he helped to create for foundational studies, namely mathematical logic and proof theory. Classical analysis and its abstract extensions have been crucial for physics and resultant technological developments. Logic and proof theory have become indispensable for computer science and resultant technological developments. Both kinds of developments have had a revolutionary impact on our social and economic life, while retaining, at the same time, a reflective philosophical side. After all, we have been exploring in the first case the physical universe and our place in it, and in the second case, intelligent machinery and the human mind, that is, capacities of it. Having made these very broad, general introductory remarks, let me give you a quick overview of my talk. Part A describes the context for the emergence of computability as a crucial notion in mathematics and logic, with a normative philosophical component. Parts B and C analyze calculable functions or natural numbers and mechanical operations on syntactic configurations. The analysis motivates the axioms for computable dynamical systems, the topic of Part D. In Part E, I want to draw connections and point out directions for what I think is fascinating work. Hilbert made his observations for a subject that had recently been expanded, indeed dramatically transformed, since its classical Greek beginnings as a systematic science. The character of this distinctly modern mathematics is indicated by its use of abstract concepts. Think of concepts like group, ring, topological space, what have you. Such concepts do not apply to privileged objects like numbers or geometric magnitudes. Rather, they are introduced via structural definitions and apply to classes of objects with appropriate relational connections. This transformation is reflected in Dedekind's essay on the nature and meaning of numbers, and also in Hilbert's Foundations of Geometry. It presented difficult methodological foundational problems, which both men addressed in a variety of ways. For Hilbert, that included around 1920, the creation of mathematical logic as a tool to investigate mathematics and as a subject to be investigated by mathematical means. The creation of this meta-mathematics has to be seen against the logical background that goes back to at least Leibniz. Leibniz, as you may remember, had hoped for the solution of problems formulated in appropriate universal language by calculation. You articulated a problem and then sat down at a table, took pen in your hands and calculated. And after finding many steps, the solution would be at hand. For mathematics, Dedekind shifted from calculations to proofs under the motto, in science, nothing capable of being proved ought to be believed without proof. Hilbert asserted very early on that proofs are obtained by finitely many logical steps from axioms. But it was Frege who formulated appropriate logical rules and claimed that in his system, inference is conducted like a calculation. Finally, Whitehead and Russell aimed for a full formalization of mathematics in their Principia Mathematica. Connecting considerations back to Leibniz, the issue of deciding by calculation whether a formula is provable in Principia Mathematica or some other logical system from finitely many axioms became one of the most important problems of mathematical logic. In 1921, Behmann, a student of Hilbert's, gave a vivid description of this Entscheidungsproblem or decision problem. And I quote, "For the nature of the problem, the decision problem, it is of fundamental significance that as auxiliary means only the completely mechanical reckoning according to given rules is admitted. That is, without any thinking in the proper sense of the word. If one wanted to, one could speak of mechanical or machine-like thinking," and he added in parentheses, "perhaps it can later even be carried out by a machine." For Neumann, only a few years later, in 1927, expressed his conviction that the problem was unsolvable. Indeed, he saw the unsolvability as a condition sine qua non for the contemporary practice of mathematics to make any sense. However, he had to admit we have no clue how a proof of unsolvability would go. The reason for this assessment was the lack of a precise concept of computation. The lack of such a concept was remedied in 1936 through a remarkable confluence of ideas. Different but equivalent rigorous concepts were introduced for two informal notions, namely that of an effectively calculable function on natural numbers and that of mechanical procedures on syntactic configurations. With such concepts in hand, Church and Turing proved the unsolvability of the decision problem. Both men addressed also the methodological issue whether their concepts were adequate to represent the informal notions. Nevertheless, the question, what are computations, has provoked ever since philosophical and other debates under the heading of Church's thesis, Turing's thesis, the Church-Turing thesis, or very recently, the Church-Turing thesis in quotation marks. The decision problem was, however, not the only issue that called for a precise concept of computation. There were mathematical problems, like Hilbert's 10th problem of the algorithmic solvability of Diophantine equations. There was the conceptual problem of deep interest to Gödel, to characterize formal theories and prove the incompleteness theorems for all of them that include the appropriate part of number theory. Indeed, That conceptual problem underlies Gödel's 1934 Princeton lectures. It was also discussed at the time with his Princeton colleague, Alonzo Church, who proposed to identify calculability with lambda definability, a notion he had introduced a few years earlier. Gödel found that idea thoroughly unsatisfactory and made a counter-proposal. Formulate axiomatically the generally recognized aspects of calculability and do something on that basis. And that is a quotation from a letter Church wrote to his student, Kleene, reporting on the discussion with Gödel. However, Gödel neither hinted at suitable axioms nor at what might be done on their basis. His remarks were later interpreted as calling for a theory in which Church's or Turing's thesis could be proved. The axiomatic approach I take is quite different. It is indicated by Dedekind's approach to the question, what are natural numbers? What the numbers are as individuals does not matter as long as their system is simply infinite. Analogously, what computations are as individual processes does not matter as long as, well, and that I'll try to explain a little later. For the time being, I want to tell you what Dedekind viewed as simply infinite systems. Here is the definition. The set of objects is called simply infinite if there is a mapping f on n and an element 1 in n, such that the image of n under f is included in n is the inductive closure of the system consisting just of the initial element 1. 1 is not in the image of f of n, and f is injective. That is Dedekind's definition of a simply infinite system, and most of you will have seen these principles as Formular's axioms ut piano. These four conditions are the characteristics of an abstract concept and serve for Dedekind as starting points or axioms for proofs in arithmetic. Dedekind also established, and established should be in quotation marks, the existence of an appropriate particular system n satisfying these conditions and proved a representation theorem. Every simply infinite system is isomorphic to this particular n, and thus the very concept is categorical. Dedekind took an enormous methodological leap when treating natural numbers via the concept of a simply infinite system and sets of objects falling under it, from the same abstract perspective as he dealt with the concept of a group or field and sets of objects falling under them. Keep this connection in mind. I will return to it as soon as I've discussed the classical approaches which point to generally recognized aspects of effective calculability. The classical approach to the effective calculability of number-theoretic functions led, mainly through Gödel and Church, to a notion of computability in formal calculi and to absoluteness theorems. Why did they work with number-theoretic functions? Well, mathematicians had experience with numerical procedures and were led to focus on the class of primitive recursive functions in the early 1920s. In 1931, Herbrand defined a broader class of functions that included also the so-called Ackermann function, not primitive recursive, but nevertheless viewed as effectively calculable. Herbrand's ways motivated Gödel's 1934 definition of general recursive functions via two characteristic conditions. And general is put in quotation marks. Gödel introduced this concept, general recursive function, as opposed to recursive functions, which were at the time primitive recursive functions. But from now on, I just talk about recursive functions, not general ones. So these recursive functions are given as unique solutions of recursion equations, and their values are calculable from the equations by formal rules. In a manuscript from the late 1930s, Gödel analyzed the way in which calculations proceed and isolated two formal rules. The first allows substitutions of numerals for variables. The second allows substitutions of equals for equals. Gödel made also a conceptual claim, namely that these two characteristic conditions are exactly those that give the correct definition of a computable function. In short, he thought at that time that his analysis provided the correct definition of computable functions as recursive ones. However, it was really a metamathematical fact that made it plausible to Gödel for the first time in 1936 that recursiveness captured effective calculability. Here is the fact as he formulated it. It can, moreover, be shown that a function computable in one of the systems Si of ith order logic is computable already in S1, S1 being elementary number theory. Thus, the notion computable is in a certain sense absolute, while almost all metamathematical notions otherwise known, for example, provable, definable, and so on, quite essentially depend upon the system adopted. So think of it as follows. Calculation procedures that can be given in a suitable formal theory of ith order logic, perhaps even transfinitely iterated, so transfinite logics. And if you can calculate it in a strong system, you can already carry out the calculation in the lowest, weakest system. In that sense, absolute. Exactly 10 years later, Gödel took absoluteness as the reason for the importance of recursiveness. Here we have, he said, the first epistemological notion whose definition is not dependent on the chosen formalism. Gödel's 1936 remarks concerned higher order systems that extend number theory, whereas the claim he made in 1946 was formulated for arbitrary formal theories that extend number theory. So you consider not just an extension via a particular higher order system, but any formal system that extended number theory. This assertion reveals also a difficulty that weakens Gödel's foundational claim. For its proof, one has to exploit that the extending theories are formal and require that the deductive steps are actually recursive. This difficulty is apparent in two analogous arguments, the first of which is due to Church. In 1936, he wanted to prove that every function computable in a logic is generally recursive. He actually gave a correct proof, assuming the logic's inference steps to be recursive. This crucial condition is mentioned, but only in a footnote. The second analogous argument is due to Hilbert and Bernays, who, in the second volume of their Foundations of Mathematics, proved that every function computable in a deductive system is recursive. They, however, explicitly formulated recursiveness conditions, guaranteeing that the steps in deductive systems are recursive. Each of these arguments establishes absoluteness, but do so only relative to the fact that inference steps in the extending logical frameworks are recursive. The question is, why should this subtly circular condition be imposed? The second classical approach to mechanical operations on syntactic configurations led mainly through Turing and Post to a notion of computability via production systems and to reduction theorems. This assertion may surprise you. After all, the 1936 models of Turing and Post don't look like production systems at all. You definitely know the Turing model. You may not know the 1936 model that was presented by Post in a paper in the Journal of Symbolic Logic. You have, analogous to the tape of a Turing machine, a symbol space of boxes. These boxes can be marked or unmarked. Algorithmic procedures are carried out by a human post worker who can carry out the following operations. The worker can mark or unmark a particular box, depending on what is in a box he is currently observing. He can perform other operations like moving to the right, moving to the adjacent box to the left. If you remember Turing's model, you see they are essentially identical. At the time, the identity of Post's with Turing's model of computation seemed to be sort of accidental. There was, however, a deeper conceptual confluence underlying their models. Post had presented in the 1920s the operations of symbolic configurations of Principia Mathematica as operations on strings. He proved then that the string operations can be reduced to those of normal production systems. And those production systems are really very, very simple. You have one axiom, one initial word on which you can operate, and rules of the following form. You have a fixed string G followed by a variable for arbitrary strings, and that string can be transformed into the very same arbitrary string that appeared in the first configuration, followed by a second fixed string. So you replace the first, you erase the first fixed string from a configuration and append to the end the second fixed string. Okay? So very simple. And all of the operations that are implicit or explicit in Principia Mathematica can be reduced to this very simple form of post-production systems. Turing gave in his 1936 an argument reducing mechanical operations on two-dimensional configurations to those of string machines, that is, Turing machines that not just operate on individual letters but on finite strings. And he observed, and he made two observations, namely the reduction of two-dimensional configuration, two-dimensional computations to string operations, and of string operations to operations of his letter machines operating on just single letters. And if you think of just a Turing machine with two letters, you see that the Turing and Post models are literally identical. These parallel reductive arguments are striking, but even more so if one realizes, as Post did in 1947, that computations of letter machines can be elegantly be described via production systems. And machine computations are then seen simply as manipulations of finite strings following production rules. Post used this formulation to prove the unsolvability of the word problem for semigroups, and Turing, in 1951, extended the unsolvability result to semigroups with cancellation by refining Post's techniques. And revealingly, perhaps, at the very beginning of Turing's paper, in the abstract to it, as a matter of fact, he says, we are going to use logical computing machines as they were introduced in 1936 by Post and the author. In further support of my claim that there is a conceptual confluence underlying the identical models Turing and Post proposed, I point to their concern with mechanical operations on broader classes of configurations, that is, with the questions what configurations, finite configurations, and substitution operations are to be considered. Though this question was important for both men, neither Post nor Turing investigated it in any systematic way. In contrast, Kolmogorov and Ouspensky viewed in the early 60s finite labeled graphs as symbolic configurations, so a very broad class of syntactic configurations, if you wish. My student John Burns and I generalized them to what we called K-graphs, Kolmogorov graphs, and introduced K-graph machines, generalizing letter machines, string machines, two-dimensional Turing machines, to arbitrary K-graph machines with appropriate generalized production rules. We proved that the computations of K-graph machines are reducible to those of Turing machines. The question here is there an end to finding ever broader classes of particular configurations and operations? When I discussed the absoluteness theorems, I isolated the recursiveness of steps as the crucial ingredient in their proofs. To obtain the reductive results for different classes of machines, one exploits general constraints on their computations. Oh, what did I do? Yeah, that's namely finiteness and locality conditions. There's a bound on the number of configurations a machine can directly work on, and the operations of a machine must locally modify one of these configurations. The finiteness and locality conditions I just mentioned originate from Turing's 1936 paper. There Turing argued that his machines can perform all mechanical operations that can be carried out by human computers. And remember, at that time, computer was not referring to machines, but to human beings carrying out mechanical calculations. For that purpose, that is, to show that computations, mechanical operations by human computers can be carried out by his machines, he wanted to isolate operations that are so elementary that it is not easy to imagine them further subdivided. And at this point, the striking feature of Turing's approach enters, namely, an appeal to the limitations of the computing agent, here human beings. He required that computers, human computers, immediately recognize symbolic configurations used in computations. And he described a quasi-experiment, namely whether you could distinguish or see that they are identical for arbitrary finite strings. But put yourself into the position of having a string of digits of length 25, say. Two of them, and you are supposed to decide by just looking at them whether they're identical or not. And you will see that if they are not completely wonderfully uniform, like just the same digit throughout, you will have a hard time to do this at a glance or immediately. Okay. So in this sense, the finiteness and locality conditions are grounded in what Turing considered evident sensory limitations of computers. This seems to be remarkably persuasive given the intellectual context. Recall that procedures allowing you to decide the decision problem were supposed to be carried out by us, not by some fancy machine or other, but by human beings. And so this notion, focusing on the restrictions, sensory restrictions of human beings, is exactly appropriate for addressing the decision problem. So, to say it once more, this seems to be remarkably persuasive, and indeed Gödel wrote in 1964 with evident enthusiasm, but without referring to the details of Turing's argument, in consequence of later advances, in particular of the fact that due to A.M. Turing's work, a precise and unquestionably adequate definition of the general concept of formal system can now be given, the existence of undecidable arithmetical propositions and the non-demonstrability of the consistency can now be proved for every consistent formal system containing a certain amount of finitary number theory. That is, he saw in Turing's work exactly the solution to the conceptual problem I described earlier on. And then he gave an explanation of why it is that Turing's work provided such a solution. Turing's work gives an analysis of the concept of mechanical procedure, alias algorithm or computation procedure, or finite combinatorial procedure. This concept is shown to be equivalent with that of the Turing machine. And I should have emphasized, shown to be equivalent. What is the analyzed concept that is shown to be equivalent to that of a Turing machine? I don't know of any answers to these questions in Gödel's published work or in his Nachlass. So let me return to Turing's argument and articulate informal requirements for computers. They operate on finite but unbounded configurations. They recognize in each configuration a unique pattern of a fixed finite list. They locally operate on the recognized pattern. They assemble the next configuration from the original one and the result of the local operation. These informal requirements can be formulated rigorously as characteristic conditions or axioms for discrete dynamical systems, S and F, where S is the state space and consists of hereditarily finite sets. F is an operation from the state space to itself, and the system is called computable if F is computable, where the computability of this function is defined as follows. And again, this is a very informal articulation. If you want to see the precise mathematical articulation, please look at one of my papers. There are finitely many patterns and local operations such that the value of F for any argument is determined by a computation via the local operations. Turing machines are computable dynamical systems. And one can establish a representation theorem. The computations of any computable dynamical system are reducible to those of a Turing machine. Now you may ask again, how does this address the central methodological issue? Well, we have the abstract notion of computable dynamical systems, and we have the concept of Turing machines. Particular systems and machines fall under these notions. The facts I just mentioned allow us to complete this part of the diagram, namely, concrete Turing machines are concrete computable dynamical systems, and every concrete computable dynamical system is reducible to a concrete Turing machine. And the completed diagram then shows that the concept of computable dynamical system is equivalent to that of a Turing machine. So in some sense, this completed diagram reflects an answer to the questions I raised after reading to you Gödel's 1964 remarks about Turing. The extension of Turing's and Post's analysis of mechanical procedure has led to the concept of a computable dynamical system, and that concept has been shown to be equivalent with that of a Turing machine. The guiding ideas of this analysis can be used to investigate machine computations, as Robin Gandy did in his 1980 paper, Church's Thesis and Principles for Mechanisms. Machines are viewed as discrete mechanical devices and are thus taken to satisfy finiteness and locality conditions due to two physical facts: a lower bound on the size of distinguishable atomic components and an upper bound on the propagation of signals. Gandy saw parallelism as the feature of machine computations that had to be captured. Extending Gandy's work, I introduced computable dynamical P systems, P for parallel computations. The finiteness and locality conditions, together with a rather complex reassembly operation, allow us to reduce computations of any P system to those of Turing machines, yielding again a representation theorem. As Turing machines are computable P systems, we can redraw or simply modify this diagram into another diagram. Namely, we have the concept of computable dynamical P systems, concept of Turing machines, concrete computable dynamical P systems are equivalent or can be reduced to concrete Turing machines. So, in any event, this is a diagram I would like you to keep in mind. And so let me come to making some connections and looking forward. The abstract concept of a computable dynamical system captures, as I see it, the generally accepted aspects of calculability. The representation theorem brings out the central role of Turing's machines and Post systems for the theory of computability. Beyond giving concrete mathematical substance to Gödel's 1964 remarks on Turing, these considerations provide more pointed directions for research that is being pursued. There is one issue concerning formal verification of mathematical theorems. The formalization in principle was sufficient for the metamathematic investigations of Hilbert and Bernays. Given the remarkable technological tools we can face the very practical issue of formally verifying theorems, and I hope in ways that are humanly intelligible. That means also to uncover strategies used in mathematics for finding proofs, and they should involve articulation of heuristics and working with diagrams, from logical diagrams to diagrams in Euclidean geometry. Such a refined verification program naturally leads to the implementation of proof strategies and to a quest for fully automated proof search. In turn, this may be the beginning of addressing Gödel's and Turing's question, what are the prospects for mathematically intelligent machinery, when focused on humanly intelligible ones? This has then also presents a deep challenge and opportunity for cognitive science. We need an understanding of the sophisticated mathematical mind, not just of very simple arithmetical minds using addition, multiplication, what have you, that is so often focused on in cognitive scientific investigations. What are the computational models for mental processes? Production systems, à la Post, have been used in particular at Carnegie Mellon in the tradition of Newell and Simon. Other cognitive scientists have used parallel distributed processes or artificial neural nets for such a purpose. The common artificial neural nets of cognitive psychology were shown by one of my students to be computable dynamical p-systems. Having briefly indicated three deeply related directions for research, let me summarize what I take to be the core of my talk. I attempted to connect and deepen the methodological considerations usually associated with the Church-Turing thesis. However, when focusing on their genuinely mathematical aspects, one is not led to an unusual methodological thesis, but one finds oneself in harmony with the reflective practice of ordinary mathematics and science. Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Umesh Vazirani, who's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the Roger A. Strauch Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science there, and the director of the Quantum Computing Center. Umesh has had a distinguished career that spans a little over 3 decades now. He got his PhD in Berkeley in 1986, and except for a few years at Harvard, he's been at Berkeley ever since. So he has totally imbibed the Berkeley School of, or the Manuel Blum School of computer science or theoretical computer science research, which is very interested in new models and analyzing new models as much as working further on existing models. For the first decade of his career, he was focused on classical computing. One of his earliest works, which a series of papers which I'm incredibly fond of, is trying to understand imperfect sources of randomness. So if you didn't have a perfect coin tosser, but sources of randomness that have correlations or probabilities that are not unbiased and so on, how do you extract perfect randomness from these sources? So, and he had some groundbreaking papers on this topic, and that has then led on to a whole field that focuses on treating randomness as a resource and how to recycle these random bits and use them sparingly and so on. That's led to very exciting work in all of theoretical computer science. Another result that I'm particularly fond of that characterizes much of Umesh's work is to isolate a nugget, an identifiable nugget of idea or insight, and then write a paper around it that uses that idea in a very interesting application. And in fact, the paper I'm referring to is trying to connect, finding randomized parallel algorithms for graph problems and relating them to problems in linear algebra. And the particular nugget he isolates is coincidentally called the isolating lemma. So that is one of the most beautiful papers I've read. He's continued to work on classical computing as he switched to his quantum phase. Another very nice result of his was done with Sanjeev Arora and Satish Rao. And this is embedding graphs in an entirely new way in abstract spaces. And from that embedding, deriving new approximation bounds on various graph optimization problems. So that is the classical work he's done. And for the last work, he received the prestigious Fulkerson Prize from the Operations Research Society. Now for the quantum. So in 1993, Umesh, working with his student Ethan Bernstein, wrote a paper which should have, in my opinion, been at least 2 papers, because it had 2 very distinct and interesting results. The first was to prove, a la Turing, that there was such a thing as a universal quantum computer. There would be one quantum computer that could simulate any other given quantum computer and produce the computation that the other computer would produce. That was not at all obvious given how finicky quantum systems are and how if you touch them, they change. The fact that there could be a universal computer required a lot of doing. The other result in that paper was actually an algorithm for doing large-scale Fourier transforms of some kind, which I won't go into, but which was immediately followed up by the landmark quantum computing paper that most of you have heard of, which is Shor's algorithm for factoring. And the Shor's algorithm drew a lot of inspiration from this work on computing Fourier transforms on the quantum computer. So those are a couple of examples of Umesh's early work on quantum computing. I would say that he has, by and large, his program in quantum computing has been to set up the fabric of quantum complexity theory, understand what the quantum complexity classes are, how they relate to classical complexity classes, and so on. So he has been single-handedly laying down the entire landscape, if you will, of what quantum computing should look like. At the same time, exploring very fundamental concepts in classical computation, like what is randomness to a quantum computer? What does randomness look like to a quantum computer? What does a random walk, quantum random walk look like? What do these things even mean? Trying to identify the meaning and then actually come up with efficient ways of doing these things. That has been the program he has set in motion. Many of you know of Umesh's students, his sort of exemplary mentorship of great students. In the classical world, for theoretical computer scientists in the audience, some of his students like Sanjeev Arora or Madhusudan or David Zuckerman are household names. In the quantum world, he actually has completely cornered the market. I mean, it's basically every one of the quantum computer scientists out there, theoretical computer scientists out there these days, has some degree of association with Umesh, which you might consider a problem as well as a good thing. But hopefully that's changing very soon because some of the students he's had are now producing their own students. But so it's my great pleasure to welcome Umesh.
Thank you very much, Sampath, for that entirely undeserved introduction. I'd like to talk about a somewhat unusual topic today. It's unusual not because I wanted to talk about an unusual topic, but because that's where quantum computing leads us to. So what I'd like to talk about is not about very fast computers, but about what the possibility of these fast computers, supported by quantum mechanics, means for our ability to understand quantum systems. Okay, so our starting point is really the starting point for quantum computation, which is that there's this very fundamental distinction between classical and quantum systems. So a classical system of n particles requires order n parameters to describe. To describe the state, you only need to prescribe order n parameters. But if you have a similar system which is quantum, then you need exponential in n many parameters. Now, of course, this might seem like a quantitative distinction, but really it's, exponential distinctions are, we should think of them as qualitative because what this means is even a few hundred particles, the description length is larger than the number of particles in the universe. So it's really impossible to describe those systems classically. Of course, this is what leads to the exponential power of quantum computers. But today we want to turn this picture around and say, well, what does this tell us about understanding quantum systems? Okay, so just to do a 2-minute introduction to all this. Okay, so if you have an n-particle system, and let's say each of these, these are 2-level systems, so each particle can be in the state 0 or 1. Then the state of this system is given by an exponential in n-dimensional vector whose entries are complex numbers, right? One for each configuration, one for each classical configuration of these n bits. And so the state of this system is a unit vector in this 2 to the n dimensional complex vector space called a Hilbert space. Okay. Now, how does the state change over time? So one way we can think of it is, let's apply an operation to 2 of these qubits. So that's something local that we can do. But in the process, what happens is we apply an operator of this form, which is some operator on these 2 qubits tensor with the identity on on the rest. And what this means is, in fact, all the 2 to the n amplitudes will get updated. Okay? In some regular pattern, but all 2 to the n amplitudes get updated in that elementary step. And so what this operation is some kind of a rotation of the Hilbert space. Now, this exponential description, of course, is the private world of this quantum system. As soon as you make a measurement, all this collapses, and what you end up seeing is one of these n-bit strings, x, with probability amplitude squared. Right? So the square of the magnitude of that complex number. Okay, so that's the basic setup for a quantum system. This is where the exponential complexity comes in. And now one can ask, well, what does this mean about how easy it is to understand quantum systems or to do science in the first place? Why is it possible to do that? So there are different answers one can give. One is, well, maybe that's a partial description. Maybe all of Hilbert space is just not occupied. Perhaps nature restricts us to only those states that sit in a tiny corner of the Hilbert space. And perhaps these states can be efficiently described, and they can be well understood. And so that might explain the world we live in. So certainly, if that's true, then that would require a significant revision of quantum mechanics. In particular, it would say that quantum computation is impossible. The other possibility is that nature is exponentially more complex than human thought. Okay, so let me try to say this in a few different ways, just to say why we should think that, why we can think of the second possibility as that. Okay, so one sort of naive way to think about this is like this. Let's think about what kind of challenge it is for us to understand the world around us. And one way to picture that is, well, up until very recently, there were somehow 2 complex objects. One was nature around us, and the other was the human brain, which is an incredibly complex object. It has roughly 10 to the 10 neurons, roughly 10 to the 15 synapses. That's a hugely complex object. And so, in some sense, one could say roughly it's a fair competition. That if we are out there trying to understand the world around us, the classical world around us. Okay, here's a slightly different way of saying the same thing a little more formally. Okay, so let me just give you two different ways that we might interpret the extended Church-Turing thesis. So when I say extended Church-Turing thesis, here's what I mean. I mean the more modern version of the Church-Turing thesis, which takes into account complexity theory, right? So it says not just it's not just trying to talk about what's computable, but also what's computable efficiently. Where by efficiently we sort of mean polynomial time and the length of the input. And so so this version of the Church-Turing thesis, which is considered the foundations of modern complexity theory, it says, you could think of it as saying that any reasonable model of computation you can formulate can be simulated on a Turing machine, a probabilistic Turing machine with at most polynomial simulation overhead. Okay, but there are two ways we can interpret this this thesis. One is by thinking of a Turing machine as the functions that are humanly computable, as we were told in the last talk. So we could think of the class P as describing what a mathematician or a mathematical physicist could compute within unlimited amount of paper at their disposal. But there's a second way of thinking about this thesis, and by thinking of the class polynomial time as representing what can be physically computed, by representing what can be physically computed by a cellular automaton. And then the equivalence between cellular automata and Turing machines sort of shows us that there's these are comparable objects. And we could say that this would be a reason to say that, that this sort of challenge for us to understand the world around us was a fair challenge because these two, these two concepts end up being the same concept. But now, once we move to quantum mechanics, what can be physically computed now changes from being polynomial time to quantum polynomial time. And that includes functions like factoring, which we do not know how to compute in less than exponential time, classically. So there's a possibility that, that this class is exponentially, it represents functions that are exponentially hard classically. On the other hand, we haven't changed the class of, the class of functions that are humanly computable. And that's the tension, right? Okay, so now what, how can we think about what this says about the possibility of doing science in the presence of quantum mechanics? So let's think about it this way, actually. Let's think about testing quantum physics. So this may be a little parochial, but I would argue from my viewpoint that the exponential growth, this is possibly the most counterintuitive aspect of quantum mechanics. The fact that it gives you exponentially more power. So it really behooves us to test this exponential growth very carefully. Now, quantum mechanics is one of the most exquisitely tested theories. So there are aspects of quantum mechanics that have been, for example, of quantum electrodynamics, that have been tested to better than 1 part in 10 to the 12, which is absolutely exquisite. It's absolutely remarkable that anything has been tested that closely. But on the other hand, one can make the argument that the aspects of quantum mechanics that have been tested have mostly have been low complexity quantum mechanics. Most of those aspects have been essentially single particle quantum mechanics, or involving very, very small amounts of effectively two-state some sort of condensate states, etc. And so there's a new limit in which one would want to test physics. Just as one of the important things in physics is to test physics in the limit of high energy or at very small scales, at very fast speeds. And every time physics has been tested in a new regime, it's brought to light completely new phenomena. And it's actually often led to an overturning of the old theory in favor of something new. And so there's this completely new limit in which to test physics in the limit of high complexity for quantum systems. But now we come upon a completely new problem. The new problem has to do with the scientific method, right? Which is, so here's sort of a cartoon version of the scientific method, which is you theoretically predict the outcome of an experiment, and then you go ahead and perform the experiment and test that the outcome is within experimental error what you predicted. Okay, so the difficulty with the scientific method in this regime is, of course, if you're in this high complexity regime where we do have exponential complexity, then how do we predict the outcome of the experiment? Right? Now, of course, we could say, well, there are certain regimes where we can apply heuristics and we believe we get the right answers, but then we are really not testing quantum mechanics in the high complexity regime. We are testing it in regimes where, in fact, there's a different theory which is tractable, which takes polynomial time, which we can compute with, and then we are checking in those regimes it works well, right? But to truly test it, we'd really have to do something that goes beyond the scientific method. Okay, so here's one thing we could do. Of course, we could build a quantum computer. We could use Shor's algorithm to factor a large number. And now, we don't have to predict what the answer is. All we have to do is take the output and test that it divides n. Right? That we can do. That's easy. Factoring is hard, but division is easy. So the moral of this is that we don't have to predict in order to test. Okay. Actually, this was the content of there were these workshops on the computational lens back in 2007, where the idea was that somehow looking at science through a computational lens can lead to interesting insights. And of course, once you're invited to speak at a workshop like that, you have to come out of the closet and you have to say what's on your mind. So I was emboldened to say all this. And in fact, Dorit Aronov afterwards came up with a very nice idea. She said, well, why isn't it, why can't we go farther than this by using interactive proofs? Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about interactive proofs. This is probably the biggest development in complexity theory over the last few decades. Okay, so interactive proof systems. So these are ways of doing the following. So say you have a computationally weak entity. Let's call him Arthur. So how does he check the work of an exponentially more powerful entity, say Merlin? Okay, but this exponentially more powerful entity, even though this exponentially more powerful entity might be honest, Arthur doesn't trust him at all. Okay, so it's an untrusted, exponentially powerful entity. Okay, so let's look at it from the following viewpoint. Okay, so let's say we consider this example of graph isomorphism. So you're given two graphs, say this one and this one on 5 vertices, and you want to know, are they isomorphic? which means is there a permutation of the vertices which maps this graph exactly to that one. And you can see out here, in fact, these two are isomorphic, because if you think of 5 as 1, 2 as 2, 3 as 5, 1 as 3, and 4 as 4, so that permutation, then it exactly maps this graph to that one. Now, graph isomorphism is, nobody knows how to solve this in polynomial time. But of course, if we have access to Merlin could solve this problem. And then, of course, what Merlin could do is provide this permutation, and then it's easy to check that the answer is yes. These two graphs are isomorphic. Okay, but that's this general property of, because graph isomorphism is an NP, so there's a succinct witness. And that's what we're checking. But now suppose that the graphs were not isomorphic. What would we do then? Okay, and this is where this theory of interactive proofs comes in. Okay, so now, instead, Arthur, who's wondering whether the two graphs are not isomorphic, will go through a round of interactions with Merlin, and this will help him be perfectly convinced that in fact the graphs are not isomorphic. Well, not perfectly. There'll be a small chance of error, but he can make that as small as possible as he wants. Okay, so here's what, and the protocol is extremely simple. So what Arthur does is, so he wants to know, he wants to verify that these graphs are not isomorphic. Okay? So what he does is he selects one of these two graphs at random and uniformly permutes the vertices. Okay, so renumbers the vertices randomly, and then sends that to Merlin. And challenges Merlin to identify which of the two graphs it was. Now, of course, Merlin can solve graph isomorphism. He knows the two graphs. So if he's given a randomly permuted version of one, he can identify which one it was, unless the two graphs are actually isomorphic, in which case a random permutation of one is just as good as a random permutation of the other, so he can't tell them apart. So what that means is, if the graphs are not isomorphic, Merlin always gives the right answer, if he wants to, right? So he can succeed with probability 1. If the two graphs are isomorphic, then he fails with probability at least a half, right? And so all that Arthur has to do is to repeat this protocol several times, n times, let's say. And then the failure probability becomes 1 in 2 to the n, right? So either, so Merlin either always succeeds or he fails with probability 1 minus 1 over 2 to the n. Okay, so now we can generalize this, and we can say, what's the class of all problems that you can solve in this way? What's the class of all problems for which Arthur can be convinced by Merlin? So this class is called IP. We say that a language is an IP basically if the same property holds, right? That whenever you want to answer yes, the prover is Merlin is going to say something which convinces Arthur with probability 1. But if the answer to to Merlin's problem is no, then the prover cannot convince Arthur with probability more than a half. Okay? Just exactly the same thing. And now there's this beautiful theorem showing that actually IP equal to P space. Right? P space includes NP. It's a very large class. It's everything that you can compute in polynomial time. Here's a fact. Anything that you can do in quantum polynomial time, you can also do in P space. So surely that says that there's an interactive proof where for everything in quantum polynomial time. And so if we think of us, human beings, as Arthur, and the quantum system as Merlin, surely there ought to be some way that we can interact with Merlin and, be convinced about something, almost about anything in quantum polynomial time. Turns out this is not true, right? Because in order to get IP equal to P space, Merlin actually has to solve P space hard problems many, many times, right? A quantum system cannot do this. And so, we really have to talk about now, instead of saying, so in other words, this is not a monotone condition, so in other words, if you can do this for P space, it doesn't mean you can do it for smaller complexity classes. Because what happens with a smaller complexity class is that the class of problems about which Arthur is going to ask becomes smaller, so the challenge becomes easier. But also, Merlin becomes weaker. And so now the challenge becomes harder. Right? So it's not at all clear what happens with quantum polynomial time. So now there was this beautiful result shown by independently by Aharonov, Benor, and Yvonne, and Rodbent, Fitzsimmons, and Keshefi, where they said, well, they couldn't quite do what I said before, but they looked at the situation where there's a classical channel, where Arthur can communicate with Merlin over a classical channel, but there's also a small quantum channel. So in other words, Arthur has a few qubits, which he can, he has the ability to prepare and store a few qubits and to transmit those qubits. So he can sequentially prepare those qubits, transmit them to Merlin, and keep doing this, back and forth. And now, under these circumstances, it's possible to verify any quantum computation. Okay, so what this what this leads to is this whole notion of interactive experiments, right? So let's say that we didn't need the quantum channel. Let's say that we could come up with an interactive proof where Arthur is classical, Merlin is quantum, and so you have a classical experimentalist who wishes to verify the outcome of a quantum experiment, to verify that the outcome of the quantum experiment is as predicted by quantum mechanics, right? And what the experimentalist does not have resources to do is compute what that outcome should be, right? So think of it this way. What the experimentalist wants to do is to use the quantum system to actually solve the problem and give the prediction, but then also check that prediction was correct. So in other words, not only that the prediction actually takes place, but also that calculation was correct. So you want to sort of fold both of these tasks into this one procedure. And so the way you can do this is, of course, by replacing Merlin by this experimental setup. And think of the verification of the outcome of the quantum experiment as some problem in quantum polynomial time. And then you just carry out an interactive proof. And if you can do that, you'd have verified any arbitrary statement that you want in quantum mechanics. Okay, so there's still this open question: can a quantum polynomial time bounded Merlin convince Arthur using such an interactive proof? And actually, we don't know the answer to that. This is probably the biggest open question in the area today. Okay, there's a paper that Dorita Aranau and I wrote a couple of years ago, which sort of outlines, the philosophical aspects of these this direction of study. Now, in terms of making progress on this question, whether a polynomial bounded Arthur can be convinced by a polynomially bounded Merlin's claims, the progress we've made to date is this. So instead of having one such Merlin, imagine that you have two such Merlins who cannot communicate with each other. So you have two such experimental setups in separate rooms that are entangled with each other. And now what we want to do is, so you have a classical experimentalist, and what this classical experimentalist has is only a classical channel, so you can interact with these two setups just by through a classical channel. And we could even think of the classical channel as being, there are two buttons on each of these apparatus, which you can push to say input 0 or 1, and there are two light bulbs which sort of indicate the answer 0 or 1. So that's the interactive system between the experimentalist and these two setups. And what we want to do is, we have an arbitrary computation in mind. The apparatus is completely untrusted. Okay, so we treat these as adversarial, and we want to know that the computation is carried out exactly as we want it. Okay? And so what we were able to show with Reichardt and Unger is that, in fact, this is possible. That somehow it's possible to take two completely untrusted quantum systems, which are initialized to completely untrusted states, and to command them to carry out a computation of your choice. Sorry, this is really the setup. You have a sequence of bits that are exchanged between the experimentalist and these two black boxes, and the experimentalist can characterize the initial state and certify the dynamics of these two boxes. So as long as the tests that the experimentalist performed are passed, then in fact you can say that he really has command over these boxes. Now, what this is based on is a famous game called the CHSH game, which is a simplification of the Bell inequality, the original Bell inequality. So it's a game where again Arthur sends a bit X and a bit Y randomly to these two devices, and gets as output A and B, which are again two bits. And the game says, the game for these two devices is to maximize the probability that a certain equality holds, that X times Y, so the product of the two input bits, is equal to the sum of the two output bits mod 2. Okay. So it's sort of, since the two devices are not allowed to communicate with each other, it's easy to verify that classically there's no way to do better than 3/4. And you can do 3/4 just by saying that the devices always output zeros, right? Because then X times Y is 0 with probability 3/4, because X and Y were being chosen uniformly randomly. And so you end up succeeding with probability 3/4. Now, when you play this game quantumly, as long as the two devices share entanglement, in fact, there's a strategy for the two devices where they can achieve a success probability of cosine squared pi by 8, which is about 0.85. if you want, this is just a semi-definite programming relaxation of the problem, and so you achieve this slightly higher probability. Actually, even more is true. So what's also true is that there's a rigidity theorem that holds. It says that if the two devices, which we, let's say we call them Alice and Bob, succeed with probability close to optimal, cosine squared pi by 8, then in fact the only way they can do this is they share a Bell state. So in other words, okay, so there's something very interesting happening here. So here's our classical experimentalist who is sitting outside from this quantum system, which can be arbitrarily complex. So in fact, what's inside this quantum system may not be 1 qubit, it may be millions of qubits. They might be in an arbitrary state. But what this theorem, the rigidity theorem, is saying is that up to a unitary change of basis, so we can change the basis of this Hilbert space and independently of this Hilbert space. And now we'll be able to identify within this Hilbert space 1 qubit. And similarly in this Hilbert space 1 qubit. And we'll be able to say those were in a Bell state, 0, 0, plus 1, 1, in this highly entangled state. When Arthur inputs, sends X and Y to these two devices, in fact, the two boxes perform exactly the CHSH protocol on that Bell pair. Right? So in fact, it's saying up to this unitary change of basis, there's exactly one way of succeeding. Right? So if you come close enough to success, there's only one way of succeeding. Right? It's a remarkable way of sort of from the outside reaching into this, what's happening inside these boxes. So now, in fact, even more is true. So what we can show, in fact, is also a multi-game rigidity theorem. What this multi-game rigidity theorem says is, so now we are back into this, into the setting that I was saying, where Arthur now sends a sequence of messages, bits x1, y1, and he gets back a1, b1, and now he sends x2, y2, and he gets back a2, b2, and so on. So they're just playing a sequence of CHSH games, right, one after the other. And the multi-game rigidity theorem says if Alice and Bob win close to 0.85 fraction of the game. So Alice and Bob are these devices. They are trying to win these games, right? They can win at most 0.85, with probability 0.85. So let's say that they win approximately 0.85 fraction of the games, very close to 0.85 fraction. So we just go through for a long period. Then, in fact, what we can assert is that there's a unitary change of basis for each side, so that we can now identify, if we repeat this n times, we can identify n qubits on this side, n qubits on this side, which sit in tensor product with the rest of the space. And these n qubits are exactly entangled pairwise as Bell states. And moreover, as these bits are input, x1, x2, y1, y2, etc., the two devices must be playing the exactly the CHSH strategy on, using one Bell pair for each round. So that's a remarkable thing, right? So it's a remarkable, so think about it this way. Quantum mechanics greatly limits our access to the quantum device, right? So you even look at it and the state changes, right? Holler's theorem tells us that if it's an n qubit system, even though it takes 2 to the n complex numbers to describe the state, you can extract at most n classical bits of information from that system, right? So there's a very strict limit to how much you can test the system, how much you can probe it, and yet there's this completely different way of reaching into the system and making sure that it's doing what it's supposed to. Okay, so for now, all we have succeeded in doing is reaching in and making sure that it has these Bell states. But now, once you can do that, you can sort of make the quantum system dance to your own tune, right? You can use tomography and computation by teleportation to leverage this multi-game rigidity theorem to force these devices to perform arbitrary dynamics of your choice. So, the best analogy I can draw is, a few years ago I'd gone to there was an exhibition of Aikido, great Aikido masters at the dojo in Berkeley. So there was a great master from San Diego and one from Paris who they had all studied in Tokyo, and they were all very highly ranked. The one from Tokyo was this very tiny man, very slight, and they were doing these demonstrations where they were taking on these big husky guys who had studied Aikido and were 4th degree black belts, etc. And what this little master what he did was he got this big hulking guy in the appropriate kind of handhold. He had his wrist locked, and from then on, anything that this master did, any move he made, this other big guy had to follow him. So he just led him on a dance. And there was nothing this guy could do to resist. And so basically, that's what the multi-game rigidity theorem does, right? So you set it up so that there's the structure, and now it's a relatively simple matter after you've done this to it's okay. Maybe it's complicated, but it's a simple matter in the sense that there's nothing conceptually that was not known before that's required to make everything else work out. Let me sort of conclude with a couple of things. Maybe the first thing I'll conclude with is this. So I'd say that probably the biggest open question in this area still is, can we do this with a single prover, right? With this, and it's not just it's an important question not just because you want to be frugal with your resources. It's also because in order to prove this theorem, you have to assume something about quantum mechanics to begin with. And so the extent to which this is testing quantum mechanics is, it's only after you've made these assumptions. So if you want to really get a test without any assumptions, then we really don't want to rely on a rigidity theorem. Right? So this is why I think this question is important, not just from the point of view of resources or efficiency, but really conceptually it's a very important question. The second thing is, these kind of techniques have found really a lot of use in this emerging area of untrusted quantum devices, untrusted quantum systems. So as I was saying before, a quantum system is not something that you can probe that easily, in the sense that both because you disturb the system and also because quantum mechanics, Halevo's theorem puts a strict limit on the amount of information you can extract. And so if you want to test a quantum system, or if there's reason to believe that it's untrusted, how do you work with it? And so this comes up, of course, in the context of cryptography, where there are these systems for for quantum key distribution, which have been, people have tried to commercialize these systems, and of course these come with a mathematical proof that, these are, there's a proof that quantum key distribution is unconditionally secure. And what it means to be unconditionally secure is that if you break the system, then you've broken quantum mechanics. Now, the funny thing is, every time somebody has built a system, a quantum key distribution system, somebody has broken it. Nobody has broken quantum mechanics. So you could ask, how could it be? Well, the point is that this proof that quantum key distribution is unconditionally secure, it's in a certain model. And that model is much more appropriate for classical cryptography. Once you move to quantum cryptography, there are new forms of attack. And the principal one is side channel attacks. So in fact, the very first quantum key distribution system, which was, which was on a desktop, which communicated 5 bits from about here to about there, at great cost and great expense. So it had a side channel, which is that whenever a 1 was being transmitted, it actually drew more, the device drew more power from the power supply. And so you could actually hear the difference. And so that was a side channel. So the qubit that was being transmitted was perfectly secure. It's just that the device was transmitting information on the side. And these side channels are extremely hard to so of course the side channels became less and less obvious, but each time such a device has been constructed, there's been a side channel and people have attacked it. So now how do you deal with this? Well, the way to deal with it is to regard the quantum device as being an untrusted party. So you think of the device as having been manufactured by the adversary who handed it to you. And now the cryptographer, who is the experimentalist, only believes what's actually tested by inputting zeros and ones and getting outputs and testing. And so this is called device-independent quantum key quantum cryptography. And recently we were able to show using similar techniques that you can carry out fully device-independent quantum cryptography. There's another such topic which is certified quantum random numbers. So in order to generate real randomness, I guess the only real way to generate randomness is through quantum mechanics. And of course, it's very easy to do that. You take a qubit, put it in an equal superposition of 0 and 1, and then just measure it. Is it 0 or 1? And you get 50-50, 0, 1. But now, what if you don't trust the device? Could you actually certify that the output is random? Now, so the insight that one might be able to do that is due to John Kolbeck in his PhD thesis a few years ago, where he sort of took actually he was working on the problem of device-independent quantum key distribution. He didn't succeed, but then he threw off this remark. He sort of had this little piece there about, well, couldn't one use these Bell inequality violations to actually certify randomness? And in fact, that has been built on since. And the net effect is that what you can do is you can say, if you design a quantum device in a certain way to generate random numbers, then you can test that device. You don't trust that device at all. And at the end of that test, if it passes the test, you would certify that this particular number that's been output was random. Right? Because because you'd be certifying that this randomness was fresh. It wasn't stored. It was not the, you know, so in other words, you know, you could have a device which just stored the randomness. You know, you could have a classical device that stored random numbers which were generated sometime in the past, and it just outputs them, and then it cycles through maybe at some point. But until then, how would you know? But in fact, what you're getting with this kind of testing is you actually get to test that this randomness was steaming hot. It was generated on the spot right there, as you were performing the test, and therefore you know that this particular number was random. Okay, so this is I think it's actually a very exciting area which is sort of a more concrete version of testing quantum mechanics. Okay, thank you.